Hello and welcome to the pre-recorded video summarizing Denver Preschool Program Quality Improvement Review and Recommendations. I'm Jennifer Schroeder. I'm from the Implementation Group and I work with the folks at the Butler Institute for Families at the University of Denver. We're providing this pre-recorded video for you today in order to give you some background information in lieu of a board meeting presentation, given that there's quite a bit on the agenda for upcoming board meetings in May and June, and we wanted to be able to give you this information outside of meeting time and then come back with any questions as needed. So this presentation is a little over 30 minutes long. So if you end up reviewing all of the presentation in order and want to go back to any slides, we've provided at the bottom of your screen, there's left and right arrows at the bottom to allow you to skip forward, go back, etc. There's also a button that will show you the outline of all the slides, so you can maybe go back and skip to recommendations or to some of the results slides. So just wanted to give you that option so that you know how to navigate through this presentation. The presentation outline, this just gives you a summary of the purpose and scope. We're going to talk about national best practices, some of the current QI components, our pilot study results from this year, and then QI recommendations moving into 2019 and 2020. So that just gives you a little bit of a guide on where to find this information in the presentation. So the purpose and scope of this review, we really wanted to understand providers' use of engagement in DPP's QI offerings. So for all of the 250 plus providers that DPP supports, that's a large group of providers. What are they engaging in? What are their interests? What do they think works well, etc.? Where is there room to grow? So we wanted to also understand the DPP coach and navigator services support process. So the DPP coaches and navigators are really the mechanism through which providers engage in many of these QI activities, in addition to DPP staff. And we wanted to pilot test the coaching readiness and fidelity tools in the field, in part because the coaching process, in addition to the training and the incentives, is really one of the biggest pillars of the relationship between DPP and providers. So sources of input for our review included the DPP QI materials. So what materials sort of provide both initial and ongoing overview of the engagement of QI, what's available, what are the expectations. We wanted to get a good understanding of what both coach teams and navigators are using to help provide support for their supportive providers. How do they have a shared understanding of the QI process? And then national coaching best practices as well, in addition to what do we think about in terms of professional development in early childhood best practices nationally. The coaching process and fidelity tracking tools. So we wanted to look at how do we track coaching, what's happening, how do we know it's working, what predicts good outcomes, what does that look like across both coaching teams. And in doing this, we ended up engaging in some form development to build on what was already happening, that just some foreshadowing for later slides is was happening but maybe wasn't as robust or consistent as what we hoped to build on. So that's where we went with the coaches, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. We also did provider and coach focus groups and got a lot of really good qualitative input from those two groups. And we also participated in coaching session observations, so really getting a first-person look at the coaching process. So national best practice, we're just going to do a quick overview of what we found out with national best practice. And just for your reference, on slide 28, we provide a list of key references that you may want to look back to that we thought really provided a good insight, some data, some research from the field, basically also some meta-analysis of what's happening in the early childhood field in terms of best practice for both professional development and QI and coaching in particular. So the first thing that we found was provider capacity building support must be timely. In other words, provided when it is needed most, and implemented in partnership with providers. And what that means is that in order for capacity building for QI, for coaching to be the most effective, it has to be scaffolded to where that provider is at a certain point in time. So we're really looking to build provider capacity, provider skill over time, which means that we have to be very focused on what is going to have the most impact at what time for them. In order to be timely with the right support, you have to have an accurate assessment of the needs and strengths of the TA recipients or the providers. Really understand where they are now, what is their current skill set, what are their strengths, what is it that they need. I mean, providers may need a lot of things, but what do they most need right now? And that would feed into timely match support. Rapport and relationship is something that national best practice would point to, the literature, research on how to best support and implement quality improvement with early childhood professionals, as well as we heard this from coaches and from providers in terms of rapport and relationship between the coach or the QI support professional and the provider was a key function of whether or not they were going to be able to both understand and do an accurate assessment of the needs of that provider, understand the context in which they're operating, but also be co-developing the support and the goals over time. So without that rapport and relationship, it's really difficult to get to an effective process between providers and coaches or other QI support folks. So again, timely and well-matched support is key here. So just to come back, and we're moving, I'm going to be moving through this in a little bit faster than if we had a Q&A. So with the understanding that we will be around and coming back for questions in the future. But just to kind of give you this high-level overview and keep moving with the QI components, we wanted to talk a little bit about what DPP is doing now, currently, and all of the QI opportunities that are provided from DPP, which is quite a lot, and give you a little bit of foreshadowing on some of the feedback. Providers really appreciate how much is being provided, so that's one key takeaway we had. To look at this in a high-level kind of overview, you're really looking at the lead coach, the coach that's assigned to each provider, as well as the navigator that helps support all of this. And so essentially the lead coach does a needs assessment, trying to understand what the provider needs, and then does goal setting with that provider. So what do you need now? And from that, a spending plan will happen that the navigator helps to manage with the provider. So what kinds of resources are going to be spent this year, and how can the navigator maybe help the provider navigate that, or just organize themselves and engage in the process in which you would be purchasing materials or curricula. Navigators also do a lot of online technology support for some of the applications that are required for ratings, as well as other grants they might be engaged in. But the lead coach also helps connect the provider with training, including one-time trainings and a series of trainings that DPP provides. There's also a DPP forum and a provider learning community that providers are able to engage in. And then the Rocky Mountain Early Childhood Conference, which has been well attended by providers in the past. In terms of coaching, the key marker there is 6 hours of coaching per year, with the option of increasing that another 6 hours as needed. So that's what's provided to providers, and engaging in the goals, support, and assessment process. Incentives are also another great opportunity for providers that we've heard good feedback on in terms of achievement awards. So if they meet all of their goals for that year, they can get a monetary award, which is very much appreciated by teachers and directors, as well as the Teach and CDA scholarships, which essentially supports educational attainment for teachers. You might remember in our previous presentations to the board that in 2017, we wanted to understand not just the what of what was being provided, which is on the previous slide. So, you know, the what are things like trainings are provided, incentives are provided. So that's sort of the list of things, of opportunities that are provided by DPP. We also wanted to understand the how. So how does this process really unfold from the beginning of the year to the end of the year? And we really think of 1 year as sort of the unit, the time frame in which we think about provider engagement. Even if coaches or navigators may be working with providers, a single provider over many years, what happens in that 1 year? So we started out in 2017 looking at navigators, providers, coaches, the council that helps organize some of the navigator work, and DPP as well. And in terms of in the beginning of the year, for example, navigators will be checking in on whether this relationship with the provider is a new relationship or is it ongoing, which may determine if they are going to dig deeper and have more orientation kinds of meetings versus just checking in and reassessing, ensuring that all activities are completed by October 1st or what makes sense for that provider in order to stay on track. Is the provider working on a rating year? That will have a big impact on what types of activities they engage in for quality improvement that year, and check on that funds are being used in a timely manner. For providers, they need to be meeting with navigators and coaches. They need to be completing surveys so that there's a dual communication process there between coaches, navigators, and providers. And the coaches are really assessing, you know, what are the needs here? Is it low, medium, and high? Are we going to do some phone check-ins, things like that? So we really initially in 2017, we're trying to get a handle on what happens from the beginning of the year to the end of the year. The big takeaway from this is that with over 250 providers, we often were saying it depends. So there's a number of contextual factors that lead into low, medium, and high need or strengths or capacity or context that made it difficult to just break it down into one process or even maybe two processes. There was a lot of contextual factors that went beyond a sequence. So we went back to, I guess, not the drawing board, but just wanted to map out a theory of change for how we see key indicators of success from the quality improvement input, which is support to providers, and how that manifests itself into provider quality, which then manifests itself into student success. And so as you can see on this theory of change on the right side of your screen, is really the long-term outcomes, the long-term impact in terms of increased ratings for providers, SHINES ratings, indicating quality, sustainable community engagement, sustainable workforce, and student school readiness and achievement, of course, is a key mission of all of this work. When you back that up into shorter term outcomes, you're really looking at teachers improving their own student assessment, their teaching being individualized to student needs, classroom management skills, and administrators being able to improve parent engagement and teacher support and increase resources and stability. So the administrator supporting the teacher process, but also being the hub as a community stakeholder, a family engagement kind of support process. In order to do all that, providers need knowledge. So of course, training comes out of that. But training and also skill development involves a participatory process. So in order to really have knowledge, have skill building happening for providers, they really need to actively engage in QI. Because as we know, and this is something that we could go deeper in national best practice, behavior change, skill building really is an incremental process that's scaffolded. And as we said, support it needs to be timely in order to build those skills incrementally over time. And so participation with providers, coaches, and navigators providing high quality support and providers actively engaging. So if you look at the left side of your screen here, we really looked at what does it mean to be ready to engage in this process? And essentially that accurate assessment, which we had indicated national best practices had highlighted in order to assess provider readiness to engage in QI, but also having an accurate match of supports to provider need. So that's the very first step in order to have an effective quality improvement process. And that leading into coaches and navigators providing that high quality support, but it's timely and it's well matched. So this led us into 2018-2019, where we really looked at, okay, we want to track what's happening from this perspective in terms of accurate assessment, timely matching of support to needs. And what we found also was that there was, all of this was happening with both coach teams, but maybe not as robust or consistently across all coach teams, across all coaches. And so the process of this is happening, but can we maybe pull together all of the sort of, assessment forms and tools that the coaches might use and pilot something that is developed in partnership with coaches. So we sat down and we talked to them about what really would be an indicator of your work in terms of providing this accurate assessment and timely and match needs. And what are you doing now? And can we integrate all of that into forms, tools that might be used across all coaches? So we really did put together readiness and needs identification. As you can see here, piloting of forms. I briefly skipped over this top row just because we had a number of QI meetings that went into this process. So you can see in October, November, December of 2018, those meetings started with coaches and navigators, and they're ongoing through April. You can also see, just to take a quick step back, that DPP relaunched the QI program committee in January, and we did a number of meetings, etc. So I'm going to talk about those results. But in the beginning of the year, we pulled together and co-developed some of these forms with coaches, as well as a coaching feedback form. So how do we know consistently across all coaches sort of what's happening? And you might say feedback in terms of satisfaction, but also feedback in terms of if we can really understand what's happening with coaches, we can better understand what really predicts provider success. So we're really looking for the providers of good coaching predictors, of good coaching practice, but what predicts provider success. And then coaching fidelity observation tool, so protocol. So we looked at these forms. We did a lot of work with coaches to really get their input and then pilot those, which means with a small sample of folks, just to see if this was really tracking with what coaches understood to be their best practice. We were also collecting surveys during this time from providers and coaches, as we normally would, in terms of just general input about what's happening with coaching, which I'll talk about. So pilot study results. The first thing we learned from the surveys that we had sent out, as we normally would, to providers, they told us about what works. And so this is both results from the surveys that we got, as well as some of the provider focus groups that we engaged in earlier in 2019, just asking them about what works, what are some key challenges with QI. Providers reported that what works is a variety of incentives. So having a number of different ways to either get achievement award funding or the scholarships, but also the free trainings are very helpful. Ease of accessing and the availability of funds directly to the teacher is a big motivator. Providers also reported that a key challenge is that they're not always aware of available QI training, coaching, and incentive options. We don't think that this is because DPP is not putting a lot of information out there. We think that this is in part due to the fact that there are so many different kinds of providers out there. And you have the DPS, which has a different communication system. You have the community-based partners, which are more, separate and on their own. And people are going to get the information in so many different ways. And as you can see here, providers noting key barriers. To what extent did the group who were surveyed, they reported back that being unsure of options was about 32%. So that just gets back to the previous slide in terms of about 32% just felt like a key barrier is they didn't know what was offered. according to their report. Time, though, was a big one. So having the time to engage in QI, trainings, coaching, etc., was a huge barrier in terms of 2/3 of the respondents reporting that. Stress, managing a lot of things in a short amount of time, of course, about 23% saying stress was a key barrier. And then staffing, and this usually gets back to having enough staff to cover the individual, the teacher, etc., who is engaging in a training. They might need to be out of the class time, and so having that staff support is a struggle. Coaches noted providers' lack of time, stress, and turnover also. So we surveyed coaches about the barriers, and they are witnessing the same barriers as providers are telling us. In terms of the QI support process, providers reported that they have monthly contact with their DPP coach, but there was a large variation of coaching frequency per site. And this makes sense in a lot of ways, partly because of the barriers, but also because providers need different things at different times, which gets back to the timeliness that we were discussing. Providers also reported, which we had heard from coaches as well, which you can see both providers and coaches reported that relationship with their coach, provider-coach relationship is key to matching the right supports, but also implementing a coaching process and connecting them with other QI options. And provider readiness assessment revealed a need for support in setting goals and readiness to engage in coaching. So setting goals, developing specific achievable goals is not an easy task and actually does require a skill. And so, having coaches actually get some more support with that in terms of facilitating a goal setting process with providers might be helpful. And, I want to stress it's not an easy thing. If you ever try to set a SMART goal, it's not so readily doable. It takes a process. So that might be one area for additional support for coaches. QI training options. So providers noted that what works is a variety of free trainings, networking, interactive format, credentialing requirements, getting new ideas from the networking meetings that they attended, usually from their peers, things they hadn't thought about before is what we heard in the focus groups with providers, having the flexibility and efficiency of online training. I will say one of the interesting things that we found out with providers is that given that there are over 250 providers and it's a diverse group, some providers felt very strongly that they did not like online trainings, and other providers felt very strongly that they wouldn't be able to do all of this if it weren't for online training. So some do not like networking. Others feel like it's the pillar of their QI because they get to meet with other providers that they wouldn't normally get to meet with. So providing this diversity of QI options seems to be key. Some providers noted that they may reach the ceiling of eligibility and want more advanced options. We heard this, I think, from sites that might be more at a 4 or 5 rating, sites that have achieved their educational goals and they've topped out of like the TEACH scholarships. So they just noted that if there were more advanced options, they'd take advantage of that. And some providers noted that challenges were staff coverage, of course, and finding the right time to get to the trainings. So recommendations for 2019-2020, which we are about to embark on. This is just at a glance here, but we have 4 recommendations given all of that input. Shift the focus of QI delivery from the what to the how. So this is really kind of the crux of looking at the process as we talked about of how QI best is implemented over the course of the year with providers. The what that's offered, the training, the diversity of options, the ability to meet different needs from a diverse group of providers is great. And we got really positive feedback from providers, and coaches also think it's very helpful. What we think that we could do more work on is having a more robust and consistent process on the how. So again, a consistent set of tools on the assessment of provider needs, on readiness of providers to engage in QI, And again, this isn't because it's not happening with coaches. Providers reported a great deal of satisfaction with their coach support, and in a few cases, more than a few cases, they don't know what they'd do without their coach. But it's just in terms of DPP being able to track and really show some trends over time with what predicts provider outcomes in terms of quality building. That's where we could be more robust and consistent. Provide more support to programs to engage in QI activities. So the barriers include time, stress, staffing, those kinds of things. It's difficult given the challenges that providers are facing, but if there is an opportunity for DPP to even put into their QI incentives to support maybe staff coverage, that may be helpful because it's continuing to be an ongoing challenge. Continue to expand training options. The training options that are currently available are great, but they also, folks want more. And having a diverse menu seems to be really key. And then enhance communication strategies to increase provider awareness of what's available in terms of QI support. And again, it's not that DPP is not putting out a great deal of communication. It's that the group of providers that DPP supports is so diverse that it's just an ongoing challenge to keep trying to think of ways to make that message stick with the providers, the 32% who said they were unaware of options. So back to QI rec number 1, we have a few ideas about action steps for shifting the focus of QI delivery from the what to the how. And that includes assessing QI and coaching fidelity based on alignment to identified needs rather than quantity of engagement. So quantity engagement is fine, and there needs to be some mechanism for auditing or tracking how much is being given, especially when resources are always limited. But shifting that, or maybe expanding that to can we track quality, high fidelity QI and coaching to alignment of identified needs. So that gets back to tracking what happened is the outcome of the coaching process in high alignment with being timely and being well matched to what the provider needs. And we think that should be sort of part of what we define as coaching fidelity. Reviewing coaching and navigator contracts to emphasize adherence to a QI support cycle. We think that might be helpful as well. Including funding and coach contracts for ongoing provider assessments and planning. Just really just a review of what's happening with that, and is there room for expansion or a different approach to make sure that coaches can ensure that this process is well documented, it's consistent, robust, etc. Consider adopting a formalized coaching model. This is maybe something to discuss further. We're not saying, immediately go to a specific model, but it might be worth a review in terms of would that be an effective process for these two coaching teams in terms of a more formalized coaching model. And then operationalize tracking and collecting data, which is, that's a piece of work in and of itself. Being able to track rapid cycle data in order to support coaching and QI is not just something you put into place and kind of runs itself. That is something that we think coaches and navigators could use additional support on, and we also think that that's something that our team as evaluators do every day, and we think we could be helpful with. So we put together this graphic that we hope is, helpful and kind of lays out what would this look like in terms of the journey of providers and coaches, and really just in terms of 5 steps. And this is the first draft of this, but we thought this would be helpful to kind of underscore what we're talking about in terms of the QI support process. So initial assessment in the beginning of the year, motivation for change, resources, organizational climate, etc., fit with the DPI QI program, developing goals in terms of co-creating the spending plan and the QI support plan, knowledge, skills, staff credentials, materials, all of that. That moves into provider support that's timely and well matched and uses all of those QI options. And then assessing progress as you go. You're looking for knowledge gain, skill gain, capacity gain. and then ongoing support. So this needs to be a data feedback cycle. So you'll see that here, key considerations is that data system support. What does fidelity look like? It really is timely and relevant support. And we just really want to stress that in order for this to work, we need metrics that are clearly defined in terms of assessment of current needs, identification of goals, and then that support. And when you're able to meet this process in terms of accurate assessment, well-developed goals, timely and relevant support, that would be your fidelity to this overall QI and coach process. The metrics for this is more process-oriented, but very doable. It's just a matter of shifting the perspective into a process metric. The QI rec number 2, that was provide more support to programs. Again, that's just about supporting provider staff release time, perhaps even incentives for substitute coverage. It's just something worth considering as this is a major challenge. Continue to expand training options, as I said, on a diversity of platforms, specialty and advanced topics, maybe even including some additional items into our survey that we put out. We help support with evaluation activities, biannual survey for providers that just continues to query their needs. The rec number 4, the last recommendation is enhanced communication strategies. Again, just being aware that this is a diverse group of providers and that it's just an ongoing communication challenge, as I'm sure you're aware of as well, in being able to get the message across to those folks. DPS administration, we heard a lot of input about from teachers and also just folks, coaches as well, some, comments on surveys in terms of perhaps that gap with teachers feeling like DPS administration might know about these options, but they don't. So that is just what we heard. We don't know further context about that, but it was, we heard it enough to where we want to lift that up and say it might be something to address. And maybe even enhancing branding for training events just so that people are much more aware and it's clear that DPP is sponsoring this training. This is where it's coming from because teachers engage in a lot of training and just maybe thinking about a more robust branding for that. So next steps for our team, the QI evaluation team, we're going to revise the pilot forms with input from coaches and providers. We just had some focus groups with them about this process, that piloting these forms this year. So we have some good input and we're going to be revising those forms. Co-develop assessment goals. We want to be able to support the data feedback process in 2019 and 2020, which again is not necessarily a readily easy kind of process to engage in. You have to really look at what's currently being collected and think about how that process would roll out and then test it out and sort of work on enhancing that over the course of the next year. Provide support to coaches to effectively use that data feedback goes along with bullet number 2, and then develop fidelity markers. So in terms of high fidelity, timely, relevant, individualized support, what do those fidelity markers look like? Can we provide sort of a high fidelity marker in terms of those metrics? And we can, we want to get the marker, the accurate marker for what high fidelity to this process looks like. So as I mentioned before, here's a reference list for some key national best practice input that we thought you might find helpful. And that's it for our presentation. We hope you enjoyed this and we look forward to talking with you soon.